What do you mean he's lifting pallets with a torn shoulder? That sentence stopped Richard Keller cold in the middle of his weekly operations report. His assistant had just mentioned it offhand, something she overheard on a call with the district manager. Said it happened at the warehouse in Denton. Richard didn't say much after that. Just nodded, closed his laptop, and canceled the rest of the meetings that day, 16 warehouses. That's what his company had grown into. He built it from scratch, started with a single rented storage unit, hauling boxes himself, delivering furniture with a rented van. Now, each location moved hundreds of units a day, serving clients across 3 states. But lately, something felt off. Customer delivery times were slipping. A few workers had quit without notice. The Denton warehouse had the highest turnover, and now this rumors of someone working through an injury? Richard didn't trust second-hand updates anymore. He needed to see it himself. He called his old friend Jacob from college, now a makeup artist in LA. And 2 days later, Richard was staring at himself in a mirror, barely recognizing the man. His silver hair was dyed brown, his beard shaved clean. The worn-out steel toe boots and faded polo shirt made him look like someone who just needed a job. He registered through a temp agency under the name Ryan, and on Monday morning, he walked into the Denton warehouse as the newest trainee. No one recognized him. Why would they? He'd never set foot in this warehouse. They'd only ever seen his face in a company-wide email once a year, maybe. And even then, that was with a suit and tie, not a hard hat and back brace. The warehouse manager, a guy named Paul, barely looked up when he introduced himself. "New temp, huh? Go find Mike. He'll show you the ropes," Paul muttered, eyes glued to his phone. Mike was a lanky guy in his 30s with a buzz cut and a quiet voice. He walked Richard through the basics: how to scan incoming shipments, where to stack certain crates, how to navigate the loading dock without getting flattened by forklifts. Richard kept his head down and listened more than he talked. His back ached by noon. He hadn't done this kind of labor in years. The pace was brutal, no real breaks, just quick gulps of water between tasks. They were short-handed, Mike explained. 2 guys quit last week. One of them walked out mid-shift. "I don't blame him," Mike said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Paul's been riding us hard, says if we don't hit quota, he'll cut hours." Richard nodded. "That normal?" Mike gave a dry laugh. "Around here." Yeah. They were stacking pallets when Richard noticed something strange. One of the guys, maybe 19 or 20, Latino, short build, was wincing every time he lifted a crate. At first, Richard thought maybe he was just tired. But then he saw the kid drop a box and grab his shoulder hard. "Hey, you good?" Richard asked, stepping closer. The kid forced a nod. "Yeah, just tweaked it." "You sure? You look like you're in pain." Before the kid could answer, a loud voice cut through the air. "Victor. Quit whining and get moving." It was Paul, coming across the floor with a clipboard in hand. "He's hurt," Richard said. Paul didn't even slow down. "He's fine. Aren't you, Victor?" Victor hesitated. "It's just sore." "It's not. You already missed 2 shifts last week. You want to lose your spot completely? You carry those crates or someone else will." Victor lowered his head and picked up the next crate. Richard felt his stomach turn. He kept working the rest of the day, but his eyes stayed on Victor. The kid barely made it through the shift. At one point, he had to stop and lean against a wall, arm dangling at his side. That night, Richard lay in the cheap motel bed staring at the ceiling. He wanted to believe this was just a fluke. That Paul had a bad day. That maybe Victor was exaggerating, but deep down he knew it wasn't. The next morning, Richard showed up early, before anyone else. He wanted to see who came in first, who stayed late, who actually carried the weight. And he saw it Mike helping Victor set up before clock-in, quietly shifting heavier crates onto his own cart so Victor wouldn't have to lift them. By mid-morning, Paul was back to barking orders, this time at a woman named Trina who had accidentally loaded a crate onto the wrong shelf. "You got ears or what?" Paul snapped. "I said aisle 5, not aisle 7. Do you even know how to read labels?" Trina didn't say anything. Just fixed the mistake and kept her head down. That night, Richard made a list. "Mike, Trina." Victor, 3 people doing their jobs, picking up the slack, being decent to each other. And one guy, Paul, running the place like a drill sergeant with no care for safety or morale. Richard had seen enough. He just needed one more day to be sure. Then he was going to blow the whole thing open. The rain came down in slow sheets the next morning as Richard stood beneath the loading dock awning, watching the crew shuffle in through the side gate. Most of them didn't speak much as they clocked in, just nodded, pulled on gloves, and got to work. The air inside the warehouse felt heavier than before, not just from the humidity. There was something unspoken hanging in the space, like everyone was calculating how much they could take before something gave. Paul arrived late. Again. He stepped in carrying a fast food cup and a half-finished breakfast sandwich, trailing the smell of bacon and apathy. He didn't acknowledge anyone except to toss his keys onto the foreman's desk and call out a lazy, "Let's get moving." Richard had spent the night reviewing old video logs from the security system, something he could access remotely as CEO. What he saw made his stomach turn. Forklifts operated without spotters. Employees lifting boxes in silence, even when clearly struggling. Paul pacing the floor like a warden, occasionally disappearing into the back office for long stretches while others scrambled to keep up. Today, Richard didn't plan to blend in. He wanted to see what happened when things got tense, when the warehouse hit peak strain. And Wednesday was truck day. 2 semis were scheduled to arrive with full inventory. That meant over 200 separate boxes and crates to unload, sort, and shelve. Normally, that would require at least 8 floor workers and 2 forklift operators. Today, they had 5. One of the forklift operators had called out sick, and Paul hadn't arranged a replacement. As soon as the first truck backed into the dock, the tension snapped taut. Victor stood beside the lift gate with his shoulder wrapped in a stretch bandage clearly improvised. Richard narrowed his eyes. That wasn't standard issue. Someone must have brought it from home. "Where's Mario?" Mike asked Paul, glancing up from the manifest. "Sick," Paul said, already walking away. "Figure it out." Mike looked at the remaining crew. "We're not going to clear both trucks by 4 with this many hands." "Then I suggest you move faster," Paul called from behind his office door. Mike didn't answer. He just turned and started organizing pallets. Richard stepped in beside him. "You want me on receiving or sort?" "Receiving." "Victor's on sort, but don't let him push too much. He shouldn't even be here, truthfully." The first few hours were a grind. Rainwater tracked in from the dock made the concrete slick. The air inside smelled of damp cardboard and diesel fumes. Trina slipped once while wheeling a dolly, catching herself with her arm against a steel beam. She didn't complain, just shook it off and kept moving. Richard saw it clearly now. None of these people were lazy. They weren't underperforming. They were surviving. Doing the best they could in a system that didn't support them. By noon, the second truck still hadn't been touched. Richard found Mike behind a stack of pallets, checking his phone with a frustrated expression. "Everything all right?" Richard asked. Mike hesitated, then handed him the phone screen. It was a message from the regional scheduler. No backup coming. Paul never submitted the shift coverage request. Richard felt heat rise in his chest. He didn't even try. "Nope," said we'd make do again. Just then, the loud clatter of a crate hitting the floor echoed through the building. Victor, he was down on one knee, clutching his shoulder. Trina had already run over. Richard dropped the manifest and sprinted across the floor. "I told you to lift with your legs, not your damn neck," Paul's voice rang out as he emerged from the hallway. "He shouldn't be lifting anything," Trina snapped, standing between Paul and Victor. Paul kept walking. "If he's too soft to carry a box, he doesn't belong on the floor." Richard stepped in front of him. "You're not qualified to make that call." Paul narrowed his eyes. "Who the hell are you?" Richard looked over his shoulder. Victor was being helped to a chair by Mike, who had already dialed someone on his phone. "I'm the guy who's been unloading pallets next to your crew for 3 days, Richard said, voice low but unshaking. "And I've seen enough," Paul scoffed. "You some kind of union plant, reporter?" Richard pulled the ID badge from his pocket and held it up. The name read Richard Keller, CEO. The room froze. Trina stepped back. Mike stopped mid-sentence on the phone. Paul paled. This is some kind of joke. No. The joke is that you've been pretending to run a warehouse while ignoring safety protocols, threatening injured workers, and disappearing for hours. Paul's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Richard turned to Mike. Get Victor to urgent care. Company cards in my truck. Trina, go with them. I want a full report from the doctor. Mike didn't hesitate. Come on, Vic. Victor looked stunned but nodded. They disappeared out the side door. Richard faced Paul again. You've got 5 minutes to clear out your desk. Security's already on the way. You can't, you're done. Paul stepped back, deflated, the weight of his arrogance collapsing under the reality of consequence. Richard turned to the rest of the crew, who had gathered a few paces away, watching in stunned silence. I'm sorry it took me this long to see it, he said. No one should have to work under what I saw here. That changes today. No one spoke. But the look in Trina's eyes, somewhere between disbelief and relief, said enough. Richard spent the next 3 hours reorganizing the floor. He called in 2 additional workers from a nearby site, cleared budget for overtime, ordered a proper medical evaluation for Victor. He even took over the forklift himself, moving crates with a steadiness that surprised even him. At the end of the shift, as the final box was logged and the dock swept clean, Trina approached him. Why'd you do it? She asked. Go undercover, I mean. Richard leaned on the pallet jack handle. Because I stopped recognizing the company I built. I needed to see what it had become. She nodded slowly. You saw it. I did, he said. But now I intend to fix it. By Thursday morning, word had spread. When Richard walked into the Denton warehouse, this time without the fake name or the temp badge, no one looked away. A few workers paused mid-task as he crossed the dock. Mike gave a silent nod from the far end of the receiving line. Trina, already unloading a new shipment, didn't stop but did glance in his direction with something close to trust. The place felt different, not fixed, not even close. But less tense. Like people were breathing for the first time all week. Richard spent the morning reviewing incident logs and safety records in the back office, sitting behind the desk Paul had left cluttered with old invoices and energy drink cans. Most of the records were incomplete. Inspections skipped, maintenance logs blank. One forklift had a warning light noted 3 separate times over the last 2 months never addressed. He made a list. Actual repairs, not backlog checkboxes. Then he called maintenance dispatch and told them a technician needed to be on site before close of business. At noon, he walked the floor again, clipboard in hand. Not for show. For notes. He stopped to observe how the loading crew communicated, now more direct, less frantic. He noted where the floor tape had worn off, making it harder to judge safe forklift lanes. Details. Small but real. As he passed the sorting bay, he noticed a man he hadn't seen earlier in the week. Short beard, large build, maybe in his 50s. He was managing a small team of temps, showing them how to properly balance the weight on double-stacked pallets. Calm, efficient, deliberate, Richard waited until the man finished a demo before stepping in. You new here? He asked. The man turned and gave a short nod. Sort of, I'm Ray. Usually work over in Fort Worth. They sent me to help cover until you hire a new floor lead. Appreciate you stepping in, Ray shrugged. I knew this place was bleeding staff. Figured it was rough, but I didn't expect to walk into a crew that's been running half-manned and twice pushed. They told you what happened, some of it. Doesn't matter, I watch how people work. That tells me enough. Richard tilted his head. What do you see? Ray glanced over his shoulder at the temps. I see folks watching each other's backs, but they're tired, not lazy, just used up. A sharp clang rang out from across the dock. One of the newer guys had dropped a dolly, nothing serious, just a misstep, but it drew attention. The sound of boots across concrete followed, and Richard turned to see an older woman jog over. She was in her 40s, heavyset, short hair under a beanie. You all right? She asked the kid. He nodded. She helped him upright, gave him a quick once-over, then walked him back to the sorting table. Who's that? Richard asked. Her, that's Denise. She's been pulling double shifts since last Thursday, doesn't say much, just works, looks out for the young ones. Richard watched her for a moment. She was already back to sorting, sleeves pulled up, wrists taped from what looked like repetitive strain. No one assigned her to lead. Ray shook his head. She's not one for titles, but the crew listens to her more than they ever did Paul. Richard nodded once. Thanks, Ray. He crossed the floor and approached Denise directly. She noticed him coming but didn't stop what she was doing until he was close enough to speak without raising his voice. You're Denise. That's me, she said, still sorting barcodes. You the boss who was undercover? I am, she looked up then. Well, you picked a hell of a week. I did. I wanted to thank you. For what? For holding the place together when no one else was. She gave a short laugh. I wouldn't go that far. I just didn't want to see anyone get crushed. That's exactly what I mean. She didn't answer, just kept working. Richard didn't push. She clearly wasn't after praise. Would you be willing to stay on as shift supervisor officially? She looked at him sideways. You offering because I'm good at it or because you're short-staffed? Both, Richard said honestly. She set down a scanner and wiped her hands on her pants. Fine, but I'm not chasing quotas if it means breaking people. That's not how I work. Neither do I. Not anymore. She studied him for a moment before nodding once. Then yeah, I'll do it. He left her to it. By late afternoon, the floor was moving smoother, still under strain but with fewer missteps. Ray had rebalanced the sorting flow, and Denise had adjusted assignments so no one was lifting heavier than they should. Richard saw her quietly rotate Victor's usual tasks to another temp who'd just arrived from the agency. Victor wasn't back yet, still at home recovering, but the respect she showed his recovery without fanfare stuck with Richard. At 5, Richard called a full stop. The crew gathered near the loading dock. Not in a formal line, just a loose circle around him. He didn't raise his voice. Just spoke clearly enough to be heard over the hum of the cooling fans. I won't take much of your time, he started, but I need to say a few things. No one interrupted. This week showed me more than any report or manager ever has. I saw people working with injuries. I saw others step up without being asked, and I saw how bad things had gotten under someone who shouldn't have been leading. He looked across the group. Denise stood with arms folded. Mike leaned against a support beam. Trina was seated on a crate, sweat still drying on her brow. That ends now. We're rebuilding this site, proper staffing, real safety protocols, and leadership that earns your respect. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded document. These are the new pay rates, effective immediately. All hourly staff here are getting a raise. Not because you asked for it, because you've earned it. A low murmur spread through the group. Second, he continued, we're bringing in a full-time safety officer, starting next week. No more guessing at what's broken or what's dangerous. He let that sit for a second. Third, he paused, anyone who wants to transfer out of this site, I'll make it happen. No questions asked. But if you stay, understand this is now your warehouse. You'll have a say in how things run. No one responded right away, then Trina raised a hand. That's safety officer. We gonna meet them, or they just a name on paper? You'll meet them, Richard said. They'll report directly to me and to Denise. Trina seemed satisfied with that. Richard glanced at Mike. And you, I'd like you to train new hires going forward. You've got a way of explaining things that sticks. Mike looked surprised. I'm not a supervisor. Not yet, Richard said. But if you're willing, we'll change that. Mike nodded once. Yeah, I'm willing. Someone clapped, just once. Then a few more joined in, not loud or showy, but steady. It wasn't celebration. It was acknowledgement. As the group dispersed, Richard stayed behind to help Ray close out the last few inventory logs. They worked quietly for a while, scanning serial numbers and stacking returns for pickup. You meant all that? Ray asked without looking up. Every word, Richard said. Good, because they've had promises before. What they haven't had is proof. Richard looked out across the now quiet floor. Then I'll give them proof. By the following Monday, Richard arrived at the Denton warehouse at 6:30 sharp, same as the rest of the crew. Not to monitor, Not to inspect, just to be there. He wore the same worn boots from the Undercover week, this time with his real name badge clipped plainly to his shirt. The rain had cleared over the weekend, but the dock was still coated in a thin film of dust and dried grit from the rush of shipments that had come through. Denise was already on the floor, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning the rotating shifts. Her voice was low but firm as she assigned stations. No shouting, no posturing, just steady control. Ray stood nearby, double-checking the updated inventory map. A few new hires from the agency were being trained by Mike in the back corner, each with a clean set of gloves and safety vests that actually fit. Not one person looked rushed. Tired, yes, but not rushed. Richard walked over to the break table and poured himself a coffee from the small machine they'd ordered last week. It had shown up on Friday, along with a proper first aid cabinet, fully stocked. The vending machine was gone, replaced with a simple fridge that now held bottled water, sandwiches, and a rotation of fruit and protein bars, all paid for by the company. Small things, but they mattered. He took a sip and crossed the floor toward the loading zone, where Trina was helping a new hire calibrate the handheld scanner. She caught his approach and finished her sentence before turning. "You here for another shift?" she asked. "No," Richard said, "but I can jump in if you're short." She grinned slightly, the first time he'd seen her smile. "We're good, you did more than enough last week. I wanted to check in. Anything breaking down, anyone not showing up?" "Not yet. We've been getting ahead of the shipments, actually. Ray's been keeping things tight." Richard nodded, then turned slightly as the warehouse doors opened again. A tall man in a crisp polo with the company logo stepped inside, carrying a clipboard and a folded laptop case. He paused just beyond the threshold, scanning the space. Richard waved him over. "Bryce," he called, "over here." Bryce crossed quickly. "Morning, sir. This is Trina," Richard said. "She's one of the longest-standing crew members here. Trina, meet Bryce." "He's the new safety officer." Trina extended a hand. "About time someone showed up for that." Bryce shook it. "Looking forward to working with you. I've already flagged a few areas to check, especially along the lift tracks." "Good," she said. "I'll walk you through the rotations after lunch." As Bryce moved off toward the maintenance zone, Denise came up beside Richard. "Had a moment with the agency this morning," she said, eyes never leaving the floor. "What happened?" "They tried to rotate in someone who'd been flagged for no shows at the Fort Worth site. I told them we're not taking bodies just to fill space. And they pushed back. I told them we'd go direct hire if they didn't clean it up." Richard didn't respond right away. He looked out over the floor, 24 people working in rhythm, voices clear but not strained, movements coordinated without the panic he'd seen just days earlier. "Do it," he said. "Start phasing out the agency. I'll have HR draft the postings by end of day." Denise finally looked at him. "You sure?" "Yeah, I'd rather train people who want to be here than cycle through temps who don't." She nodded slowly. "All right, I'll start pulling names." They stepped apart as the next shipment truck rumbled into the dock. The air brakes hissed and the back gate clanged open, revealing a cleanly stacked set of modular furniture crates. Ray shouted a quick direction to the lift operator, who maneuvered the forks into position without hesitation. Richard stayed out of the way, watching as the team worked. When Mike walked past with a fresh stack of barcodes, Richard motioned for him to pause. "How's Victor?" he asked. "He's good," Mike said. "Doctor gave him a partial tear diagnosis. 2 weeks of rest, then they'll reevaluate. Company's covering everything?" "Yeah." Denise made sure the paperwork went through Friday. "She's been on it." Richard nodded. "When he's cleared, tell him his spot's waiting." Mike gave a short nod and continued on. At 11, the shipping coordinator from Regional arrived. Her name was Lena Short, sharp-eyed, always moving. She walked the floor with Richard for 15 minutes, checking off the new barcode software integration and confirming the updated route schedules. At the end of her visit, she pulled him aside. "You flipped this place in less than a week," she said. "I didn't flip it," Richard replied. "They did. I just got out of their way." Lena glanced around. You thinking of doing the same thing at the other sites? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the far end of the floor where a new hire had just finished learning how to use the powered lift cart. Trina gave him a quick thumbs up before stepping back into her own task without missing a beat. I'm thinking, he said finally, that I've been building from the top down too long. Time to reverse it. Lena raised an eyebrow. You're going to visit the others, one by one, Richard said. No announcements, no scripts, just show up. She gave a slow nod. Well, if you need backup, let me know. I've got a few managers who need a wake-up call. Richard smiled faintly. I might take you up on that. As she left, the warehouse settled back into its rhythm. The hum of machinery, the beep of scanners, the scuff of boots across concrete. No yelling. No tension. Just work honest and focused. At 2, Richard met with Bryce in the back office for a quick walkthrough of the initial safety findings. Most of what I found is correctable, Bryce said, scrolling through his tablet. No major violations, but some bad habits, lack of signage, outdated emergency drill procedures. I'd recommend a full retraining cycle. Do it, Richard said, and make it paid. Bryce looked up. All staff? Yes, he logged the note. You want to sit in? I'll be there. By the end of the day, Richard walked the floor one last time, not to check anything, just to see. He passed Denise, who was finishing up a crew rotation schedule on the whiteboard. She didn't speak, just raised a hand briefly as he passed. In the far corner, one of the new hires, a kid maybe 20, nervous on his first day, was organizing strapping tools. He dropped one and bent to pick it up. Ray walked by and paused, crouching beside him to demonstrate how to load it into the bracket correctly. No rush, no scolding, just guidance. Richard stepped outside into the fading afternoon light. The sun had finally broken through for the first time in days, casting long shadows across the dock. He stood there for a moment, just breathing it in the sound of forklifts behind him, the low rumble of a delivery truck pulling away, no fanfare, no speeches, just a shift done right, and tomorrow they'd do it again.